Welcome to the world of Sci-Fi Stories, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. Aliens finally learn why no one dares attack weak Earth. For centuries, the galactic community had laughed at Earth, a backwater planet, filled with fragile primitive creatures who barely understood space travel. The Council of Dominion, a ruling body of the most powerful empires, didn't even bother acknowledging Earth as a real civilization. They were weak, they were unimportant. They were nothing, at least that's what the galaxy believed then. The Tsar-Ari Empire made a mistake. A species known for its brutal conquest, the Zarari, had crushed hundreds of worlds, leaving only smoldering ruins and enslaved survivors in their wake. Their six-lined war beasts, standing twice the size of the average human, were bred for one purpose: destruction. Their fleets darkened the skies of entire planets, wiping out resistance in days. So when they turned their hungry eyes toward Earth, the Council barely reacted. Let them take it, the Corvin ambassador had scoffed. Humans are nothing but hairless apes. If the Zarari want to waste their resources, let them. It was meant to be an easy invasion, a mere formality before another banner was raised under the Zarari Empire. But the moment the first Zarari ships entered the Sol system, something went wrong. The Zarari command vessel, the Unyielding Wrath, led the charge, massive, bristling with weapons, and surrounded by a fleet of destroyers. It should have been an unstoppable force. Their warriors readied themselves for the slaughter. Their tusks polished, their claws sharpened. They were prepared for battle, but they weren't prepared for what happened next. Within seconds of their arrival, a single transmission was sent to the Zarari fleet. No human warship had even launched, yet no defenses had fired. The message was simple: turn around. You do not understand what you are about to awaken. The Zarari commander scoffed. Arrogance was in their blood. They responded with their own message, filled with mockery and threats. Then they heard the laughter. It was human laughter, but something about it was wrong, distorted, layered. It came through their communication systems. Even after they cut the line, it echoed inside their helmets, inside their ships, crawling under their exoskeletons. Like an infection, their translator systems tried to analyze it, failed, tried again. The laughter twisted, deepened, and the words that followed weren't in any known human language. The sound came from everywhere, and then one by one systems began shutting down. The Zarari scrambled to reboot controls, but every time they restored a function, another failed. Weapon systems were the first to go, shields next, and then the lights. Total darkness fell over the Unyielding Wrath. Only the emergency crimson glow remained, bathing the towering war beasts in eerie light. The Zarari warriors, undefeated in battle, now felt something alien to them: fear. Then came the whispering. At first they thought it was just their own crew, but the voices came from inside their helmets, speaking in their own language. Words that made no sense, words that twisted their very thoughts. One warrior screamed, tore off his helmet. Another fell to his knees, clawing at his own eyes, shrieking about the ones that live in the dark. No one understood what he meant. The ship's sensors flickered back online for only a moment, long enough to detect something moving. Not ships, not missiles. Something else, something impossible. They were inside the ship. The Zarari had never seen a human yet. They had expected resistance, expected weapons, expected desperate screams for mercy. They had not expected this. The invasion had not yet begun, and already the Zarari were losing. Panic spread like wildfire through the Unyielding Wrath. The Zarari were warriors, conquerors, creatures forged in the fires of endless war. They had crushed entire civilizations without a second thought. Yet now, in the depths of their own flagship, they trembled. The whispers slithered through their helmets, through their armor, through their very minds. Words that made no sense, words that felt wrong. They are watching. You should have turned back. No, it's too late. The ship's commander, Overlord Garen, slammed his clawed fist onto the control panel, trying to re-establish order. Enough of this, he roared. Get the lights back on, find the source of these signals, and shut them down. His engineer scrambled to obey, but every system they tried to restore flickered and died, as if something was inside the ship, tearing it apart from the inside out. The transmission from Earth came again. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a question. Do you know what your predecessors did? The bridge crew exchanged uneasy Glance's predecessors, what predecessors? The Zerari had never encountered humans before. As far as they knew, Earth was a new target, an easy conquest. Overlord Garen sneered and barked back a response. "We do not care your species. Will kneel before us or burn." The laughter returned, but this time, it wasn't just distorted audio this time. The laughter came from behind them. One of the bridge officers turned, his mandibles clicking nervously, his eyes widened, his entire body froze in place. "Oh, Overlord!" Garen spun around. There was something standing at the back of the bridge, not human, not alien, a shadow. A thing with no face, yet it felt like it was grinning. It towered over them, stretching unnaturally tall, its form flickering like static on a broken screen. The bridge officers grabbed their weapons and fired plasma rounds, sliced through the air, passed right through the figure, and impacted the walls behind it. The shadow didn't react then. It took a step forward. The nearest officer dropped his weapon and fell to the ground, convulsing. His eyes rolled back, his breathing slowed. Then, without a sound, he stopped moving dead. Garen felt his instincts scream at him to run, but he was a Zerari warlord. He did not run. With a snarl, he barked, "Orders, get me a boarding crew. With these humans have some kind of psionic trick. We'll rip their skulls from there." The ship tilted, not because of a weapon strike, not because of an external force, but because something was pulling them. "Overlord!" one of the engineers shrieked. "We were moving toward Earth's surface. Our thrusters aren't responding." Garen slammed his claws onto the control panel. "Fire the reverse boosters. We can't. Everything is offline." The ship accelerated through the massive viewport. Earth loomed larger and larger, its blue surface now glowing with a strange, eerie light. And in orbit just outside the planet's atmosphere there were wrecks. Hundreds of them, Zerari warships, Dominion vessels, remnants of fleets long thought missing, silent, abandoned husks floating in eternal orbit around Earth. Like a graveyard. Garen's eyes widened, his mandibles twitched. The realization finally dawned. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to invade Earth, and no one had ever returned. Then, just as the ship's hull began to tremble from atmospheric entry, the whispers returned one last time. "You were warned." The ship plummeted, and Earth finally opened its jaws. The Zerari warships screamed through Earth's atmosphere, their hulls burning as they fought against the invisible force dragging them down. The unyielding wrath, once a symbol of unstoppable conquest, now plummeted like a wounded beast. Alarms shrieked across the ship. Warriors clung to anything they could find as the world outside spun in a blur of fire and chaos. Overlord Garen roared above the noise. "Brace for impact." Then everything shattered. The flagship slammed into the surface, metal shrieking as it carved a mile-long trench into the Earth. Smoke and flame rose from the wreckage. The once mighty vessel, now nothing more than a broken husk. Smaller Zerari ships crashed around it, some detonating on impact, others vanishing midair as if they had simply ceased to exist. Yet, despite the devastation, Garen was still alive. Pain racked his body as he pulled himself from the debris. His vision blurred, his ears rang around him. Zerari warriors groaned and stumbled from the wreckage, some barely clinging to life, others crushed beneath the ruined metal. But something was wrong. It wasn't just the crash, it was the silence. There was no resistance waiting for them, no human army surrounding the wreck, no aircraft bombing their position, no sign that Earth's defenders even acknowledged their arrival. And yet the air felt heavy, like something was watching. Garen staggered forward, his claws digging into the dirt. He activated his communicator command. "This is Overlord Garen. We have crashed, but we are still operational, requesting immediate extraction." Static. He tried again. Command respond. Only the same sound came back, but buried within the static, deep and distant, was breathing, slow, measured, listening. Then a voice, "You should not have come here." Garen's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't human, it wasn't Zerari, it was something else. Then one of his warriors screamed. Garen spun toward the sound. A soldier, massive and battle-hardened, had collapsed to his knees. His armor, built to withstand the harshest conditions in the galaxy, was melting. No, in his exoskeleton beneath it, decayed in real-time flesh, sloughing from bone, mandibles disintegrating into black dust. And then he was gone, not dead, not even a corpse remaining, just gone. The others Zarari recoiled, their warrior instincts wearing, with something primal inside them. Fear. What is this one of them? Snarled. Then they heard the footsteps, not human, not alien, just footsteps coming from the wreckage, from the shadows, from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then came the laughter, the same laughter from the ship, warped, endless, wrong shapes, moved in the darkness, and for the first time in his life, Overlord Garen felt true terror, because he finally understood this planet was not weak, it was never weak, it was a trap. And they had walked straight into it, the Zarari, the galaxy's most feared. Conquerors had never known a true enemy. They had faced resistance before, but resistance was predictable: soldiers, weapons, defenses, nothing they couldn't crush. But this was something else. Overlord Garen stood frozen, his claws twitching over the handle of his plasma blade. Around him, his warriors fanned out, weapons raised, scanning the smoke-filled battlefield. Wreckage littered the ground, fires flickered against the night sky, and the air was thick with the scent of burning metal. But there were no human soldiers, no incoming airstrikes, just shadows and whispers. You are not the first. The voice slithered through the cowls, the air inside their heads. Some warriors ripped their helmets off, desperate to escape the sound. But there was no escape. A soldier beside Garen twitched. He staggered, dropping his rifle, claws digging into his own skull. As his breathing turned ragged, his mandibles clicked erratically. Eyes unfocused. Overlord, the warrior rasped, "I hear them inside." His body convulsed. Then, without warning, his head snapped backward at an impossible angle. A sickening crunch echoed through the battlefield. He dropped lifeless. Garen's throat tightened, spread out. "Stay alert." The remaining warriors obeyed, forming defensive positions around the wreckage. Their plasma rifles glowed in the darkness, scanning for any sign of movement. Then one of them fired a bright bolt of energy streak into the smoke. The impact lit up the battlefield for a fraction of a second, revealing nothing: no enemy, no figure, but the soldier who fired. His body jerked violently. He was yanked backward, dragged into the shadows by an unseen force. His screams lasted only a heartbeat before being silenced. The warriors panicked. They fired into the darkness, plasma bolts scorching the landscape, but hitting nothing. The air thickened. The ground beneath them felt wrong, as if they weren't standing on solid terrain anymore, but something alive. Then the ground moved. It rippled beneath their feet, pulsating like the flesh of some massive unseen beast. The air filled with a deep rhythmic sound, not a growl, not a roar, but breathing. Something old, something massive, something watching them. Garen's mind raced. This wasn't a battlefield, it was a graveyard. "You were warned," the voice whispered again. Garen gritted his fangs. "What are you?" he roared into the calm silence. Then finally a response: "We were here before you, before your kind, before the council, before the stars themselves, and yet you came as they always do." Garen's blood ran cold. They had thought Earth was just another primitive world, but this planet, it wasn't just defended, it was alive. And it remembered. A warrior near Garen suddenly screamed. He turned just in time to see the soldier's body twisting, his exoskeleton warping, melting as his form stretched into something unnatural. His limbs elongated, his mandibles cracked apart, his eyes turned completely black. Then, in a single jerky motion, he stood up again. But it was no longer him. It turned its head toward Garen, and when it smiled, he knew they had never been fighting humans. They had been fighting Earth itself, and Earth had already won. Garen staggered back, his warrior instincts screaming at him to run, to fight, to do something. But how did one fight a planet? How did one conquer something that became its enemy? The soldier, who had just transformed his former comrade, took a step forward, his movements jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. His mandibles twisted into something that shouldn't have been a smile, and his voice, when it came, was layered, a distortion of his original tone mixed with others. "Many others, you hear them, don't you?" The thing that had once been a warrior whispered. More screams erupted around them. The Zarari forces, hardened killers who had conquered countless worlds, were being picked off one by one. Some were dragged into the shadows, others simply changed their bodies, twisted, their minds taken, their voices merging into the ever-growing chorus of whispers. Garen's mind raced. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of advanced human weapon. Psionics, mind warfare, hallucinations. It had to be, but the planet itself pulsed. Beneath his feet the air thickened with unseen eyes, the sky itself seemed to darken despite the fires. No, this was no human trick, this was something older, something waiting. A sharp click echoed behind him. Garen spun his plasma blade, igniting in a flash of blue light. One of his warriors, a veteran, a survivor of 100 campaigns, stood before him trembling. His rifle was raised, but not at an enemy, at him. Overlord, the soldier gasped his breath, right, his body shaking violently. I hear them inside. With a sudden brutal movement, the warrior jammed the barrel of his rifle beneath his own jaw and pulled the trigger. A flash of green plasma, a sickening hiss, his body crumpled, and the whispers grew louder. Garen's breathing turned shallow. He had to regroup, had to do something. His eyes darted across the battlefield, searching for survivors. Most of his forces were already gone, taken, consumed, or worse. But a handful of warriors still clung to their training, forming a defensive perimeter around the wreckage of the unyielding Wrath. He sprinted towards them. Fall back to the ship, he roared. We make our stand there. The remaining warriors obeyed, retreating toward the shattered hull of their once mighty flagship. They weren't thinking about victory anymore, only survival. But as they reached the wreckage, a terrible realization settled over them. The ship was changing. Its metal hull, once a proud display of Zerari engineering, was warping, twisting, pulsing like living flesh. Strange veins ran along its surface, dark and pulsing, as if the planet itself was consuming it. One of the warriors hesitated. Overlord, the ship. A wet, tearing sound cut him off. Something emerged from the wreckage. It had no name, no true form. It was the ship, it was the battlefield, it was Earth. And it had no intention of letting them leave. Garen finally understood. They had been so arrogant. They had thought Earth was weak, but the reason no one had ever conquered this world wasn't because it lacked defenses, it was because it didn't need them. This planet did not surrender. This planet did not bow. This planet fed, and now the Zerari would become part of it forever. Garen's claws tightened around his plasma blade, but deep down he knew it wouldn't make a difference. Nothing with this planet had already won. The thing emerging from the wreckage was unlike anything he had ever seen. A mass of shifting, writhing material, part metal, part flesh, part something else. The remains of the unyielding Wrath twisted into it, folding and reshaping like a ship being devoured from the inside. No, not devoured, transformed. And then it opened its eyes. Thousands of them, black, empty voids, staring in every direction. At once a terrible, crawling realization slithered down Garen's spine. The ship wasn't being consumed, it was becoming part of Earth. A low, sickening voice rumbled from the entity, not a voice in the way beings spoke, no sound, no vibration. It was something deeper, something that spoke inside him. We remember you. The Zerari warriors recoiled. One of them screamed, unleashing a wild barrage of plasma fire at the shifting horror. The bolts of energy struck the mass, burning holes in it only for the wounds to breathe. And close, and then the warrior who fired the shots gasped. His plasma rifle melted in his hands. His armor tightened against his exoskeleton. He looked down. His body was fusing into itself. He tried to scream, but his mouth sealed shut. His limbs bent at impossible angles, his form curling inward, shrinking, until he was no longer a soldier at all, just a lump of something writhing, shifting, changing. Then he was gone, and the thing with 1,000 eyes laughed. Garen turned to his remaining warriors. We're leaving now, but Overlord. Now he activated the emergency beacon on his wrist. There were still Zerari ships in orbit. He didn't know if they had received his distress signal, but he didn't care. He refused to die. Here he refused to become part of whatever this was. The surviving Zerari sprinted toward the edge of the battlefield, their massive forms cutting through the smoke and wreckage. The whispers followed them. The air pulled at them. You were warned. One of the warriors suddenly vanished mid-stride, one moment running beside Garen, the next moment gone, as if he had never been there at all. No scream, no sound, just eraser. Garen didn't stop. He could see it now, the wreck of a landing craft half buried in the dirt. If they could get it airborne just for a moment, they could escape. He reached it first, slamming his clawed hands against the hatch. Get inside. The surviving warriors clambered into the ship, their breathing ragged, their minds breaking. Garen followed last, slamming his fist against the control panel. The engines flickered, then sputtered, then died. A long, slow sigh filled the air around them. not from a creature, not from a being from Earth. Itself the sky above darkened further, the stars vanishing one by one, and then something moved, not in the wreckage, not in the shadows, but beneath the planet's surface. Something ancient, something vast, something waking up. Garen gritted, his fangs numbered. He would not die here. With a roar, he ripped the emergency panel from the control console, exposing the raw wiring beneath. His claws sparked against it. The ship trembled, and against all odds, the engines roared to life. The landing craft lurched into the air, shaking violently. As it fought against the pee of the planet, the surviving warriors clung to whatever they could. The ground below rippled, twisting like a living thing, as if the very land itself was reaching for them. But they were already rising higher. Higher, the smoke cleared, revealing the wreckage-strewn battlefield beneath them. And in the center of it, a shape stared up at them, the thing that had once been. The unyielding wrath was no longer just a ship, it was something else now. Something watching, something smiling. Garen refused to look at it any longer. He locked his gaze on the sky above, on the void, on the hope that if they could just get past the atmosphere. The ship's sensors flickered to life. A transmission crackled through. "This is the battleship Eternal Dominion in high orbit, Overlord Garen. Do you copy?" Garen nearly collapsed from relief. "We copy. Immediate retrieval. Do not land." "What happened down there?" the voice on the other end asked. "Our scanners detected no enemy activity, just static." Garen's mandibles clenched. How could he explain? How could he put into words the horror that had unfolded? "Do not attack this planet," Finley said, his voice hollow. "Do not return. Do not send scouts. Do not even look at it." Silence. Then Overlord Garen closed his eyes. "Burn the records. Mark this world is forbidden, and never speak of it again." The transmission cut. The landing craft broke through the atmosphere, escaping the grip of the planet below. Garen didn't look back. He never wanted to see Earth again. But Earth saw him, and it remembered. It always remembered, because Earth was not weak. Earth was not prey. Earth was something else entirely. And the galaxy would never understand why no one ever returned, because the ones who did, they were never the same again. Even after escaping Earth's atmosphere, Garen could still feel it. The whispers had stopped, but their echoes lingered in his mind. The darkness of space should have been comforting. A return to the cold, uncaring void he had always known. But something about the stars felt wrong now. He had seen things no warrior should see, and Earth had seen him back. The landing craft drifted into the docking bay of the Eternal Dominion, one of the Zerari Empire's most powerful warships. The surviving warriors, what little remained of them, stumbled out, their expressions hollow, their bodies trembling. They were the lucky ones. Some had not escaped, some had changed, and some had simply ceased to be. Garen had been in wars before. He had seen warriors crushed, burned, torn apart. He had never seen an army unmade. The ship's commander, High Warlord CAC, waited for him at the bay entrance, a towering Zerari with obsidian black exoskeleton plating. KAC was a legend among their kind. He took one look at Garen and frowned. "You look like you crawled out of a grave." Garen's mandibles twitched. "That would have been preferable." Kak's gaze flicked to the surviving warriors. "This is all that remains of your invasion force." Garen nodded. "And it was never an invasion. It was an execution." Kak's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Garen opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. How did he describe what had happened? How did he explain that a planet had eaten his army instead? He simply said, "We need to leave now." GAC folded his arms. "We don't flee from backwater planets. The invasion fleet is still en route. We need to call them back." Garen snapped, his voice shaking. "Do not let them set foot on that planet. Do not even let them orbit it." Kak's mandibles twitched in irritation. "You're panicked. That is not the way of a warlord." Garen grabbed him by the armor, his claws digging into the plating. "I watched warriors dissolve. I watched our strongest fighters turn into things. I saw our ship become part of the planet itself. You don't understand." CAC, "We didn't find a defenseless world. We found something waiting for us." Krivik's patience wavered. His clawed hand shot up, gripping Garen's wrist. "Get a hold of yourself. You sound like a mad ale." Low hum filled the air. CAC froze. So did Garen. The sound wasn't coming from the ship's engines. It wasn't from the docking bay machinery. It was coming from inside them. One of the surviving warriors collapsed to his knees, his entire body shaking violently. His mandibles twitched, his eyes, once fierce and golden, turned completely black, and then he laughed, the same distorted, broken laughter that had haunted the comms. The air in the docking bay grew thick, the lights dimmed. Not from a malfunction, but from something else. The warriors stepped back, their weapons raised, but Garen already knew they hadn't escaped Earth. Earth had come with them, and it was still hungry. The laughter sent a ripple of cold terror through the Zarari warriors. It wasn't just coming from the soldier on his knees, it was spreading. The sound layered itself, as if 100 voices whispered beneath it, growing deeper, closer. Then the fallen warrior's body began to change. His exoskeleton cracked, splitting like dried leather. His limbs twitched, elongating slightly, his claws curling unnaturally. His breathing turned ragged, wet, and then he lifted his head. His golden eyes were gone, only black voids remained. Ji-on's grip on KAC tightened. "Do you believe me now?" CAC was silent. The transformed warrior staggered to his feet, his posture wrong. He looked around the docking bay, tilting his head as if listening to something no one else could hear. Then he smiled. "It's still watching." CAC drew his plasma rifle and fired. The shot hit the thing square in the chest, burning straight through its armor. It should have fallen, it should have died, but instead it laughed again. The hole in its chest moved, closing over, as if the wound had never existed. The creature flexed its claws, looking down at its own body like a child inspecting a new toy. Then it took a step forward. "Contain it!" CAC roared, shoving Garen back and aiming for another shot. The other warriors followed suit, their weapons flaring to life. Plasma bolts slammed into the thing's body, scorching its exoskeleton. But it did not fall. It grew, its form twisted, the black voids in its eyes expanding, spreading outward like cracks in reality itself. And then the docking bay screamed. Not the warriors, not the creature, the ship itself. The walls groaned, metal warping and breathing. The floor beneath them pulsed, the very air shuddered, rippling like disturbed water. The eternal dominion was changing, becoming something else. "You brought it with you," the thing whispered. One of the warriors broke. He turned, sprinting toward the blast doors, toward escape. But before he could reach it, the door melted into flesh and opened. The warrior's scream was cut short as the door swallowed him. Garen's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. They had escaped. They were in orbit, light years away from that cursed planet. But the truth was undeniable. They had never left Earth. Because Earth had never been just a planet, it was something else. And now it was spreading. The creature that had once been a Zarari warrior let out a slow, satisfied breath. Then it turned its gaze to Garen. "You never should have come." Garen felt something inside him crack. This wasn't just an invasion gone wrong. This was an infection, and now it was in their fleet, in their empire, and soon it would be everywhere. Garen had never felt true hopelessness before. He had fought battles where the odds were against him, stood against enemies that outnumbered him 10-1, survived wars that had crushed entire civilizations. But this was something else. His claws trembled on the grip of his plasma blade, not out of fear. He had accepted fear long ago, but because some deep primal part of him knew this fight had already been lost. The thing that had once been his warrior took another step forward, its mandibles stretched in a grotesque mockery of a Zarari expression. Its eyes, those empty voids, fixated on him, and then it spoke. "You think you escaped?" The whispers came from inside his mind, crawling beneath his exoskeleton, slithering into every crack of his thoughts. "You brought us with you." Around him, the docking bay breathed. The walls swelled and contracted, the metal groaning, as if becoming something organic. The ship was changing, becoming part of it. KAC, still standing beside him, let out a slow exhale. "Overlord, tell me this is a nightmare." Garen didn't answer, because it wasn't. The transformed Zarari warrior lunged faster than he should have been. Faster than anything should have been. Garen barely reacted in time. His plasma blade flared to life, swinging upward. The blade cut straight through the thing's torso, splitting it in half for a fraction of a second. He felt relief then. It laughed. The severed halves ride black tendrils, slithering through the air, pulling themselves back together. The wound healed as if it had never been there at all. KAC snarled, "Fall back now." The remaining warriors turned and ran, not because they were cowards. Zarari did not retreat, But this was not an enemy they could fight. This was not an enemy at all. This was a plague.